The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar today. I guess today's Tuesday, March 31st. We got one more day till April Fool's, but I don't know if anyone's in the April Fool's mood this year. But we're going to make this lighthearted and have a good time. I am Russell Graves, and with me today is Russ Nordstrand, the owner and director of Backcountry Journeys, and his right-hand man, Kenton Kruger. Hi guys.
Hey Russell, thanks for having us.
Yeah, so these two guys are going to comment along with me today, and it looks like we got a pretty good crowd in here. How many did you say? You have 56 attendees? Yeah, it's a good crowd, and you know, one of the things I want to talk about at first before we get started into the material is you guys that are out listening today. I want to make this as much of a dialogue as we can, as instead of just a monologue. So as I go through some of these things, feel free to type in your questions and get those up front. I'll answer them as we go. And just to make sure that everyone's satisfied in the information that I'm going to present today, it's really going to be kind of a casual conversation between all of us. You know, if you've ever been on a trip with me, I've got a technical knowledge of photography, of course, but I think one of the things people tend to do sometimes is overthink the photography part of it. So today I'm going to talk about some practical ways you can take better wildlife photos. That, of course, we're going to talk about the technical part of photography and how I took the pictures and how I accomplished them, but we're going to kind of take a little bit deeper dig into some of those things that maybe you haven't thought about that'll help you get some better wildlife photos. So tell you a little bit about me. My name is Russell Graves. Usually if I'm doing this in front of a live audience, I'll have a show of hands of how many people know where Dodge City, Texas is. And it's rare that anyone ever knows. So without Googling, chime in on the questions if you know where Dodge City, Texas is. Hang on a second. Hey, Russ.
Caller.
I'm having a little trouble on my question tab.
Yeah.
Can you drop that thing down and open the questions? I don't know why. When I'm on full screen mode, my mouse doesn't seem to work. There we go. Again, my name is Russell Graves. I'm from Dodge City, Texas. I grew up, I live in the country north of Dodge City, Texas. It's a small town of about 250 people in northeast Texas, northeast of Dallas, up near the Red River. This is the area of Texas I grew up in, and for the past 25 years, I lived in northwest Texas near Childress, but I've recently moved back closer to my home and bought a little bit of land and am enjoying life here near where I grew up and near all my family. Tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a commercial and editorial photographer by trade. I've been shooting pictures for a long time for not only national magazines, but a lot of regional magazines as well. And I shoot a lot of commercial work and do ad campaigns for various companies in the outdoor, agriculture, and hunting and fishing related fields. Also a guide for Backcountry Journeys. Started that, how long did I start that, Russ? A year and a half ago? Something like that? Yeah, almost 2 years ago. 2 years ago this spring was my first trip.
Yeah.
And it's been a great experience. I've fallen in love with Russ and his company and his philosophy on how to do things. And I'm a people person by nature, so I love getting to meet people and talking photography with everyone. I'm also a magazine writer and a book author. Like I mentioned before, primarily in the outdoors, agriculture, and travel industries is who I work for. And then I've been in business since 1989. One of the things, I'm not a young guy anymore. I'm 50 years old. But one of the things that when people would meet me at one of the speaking events I do, they'd always say, "I always thought you're older than what you are." And the reason why is I had my first pictures and words published in a magazine and got paid for it in 1989 when I was 19 years old. And so I've been in the business doing this for an awful long time now. So going on my 31st year of being in the photography and writing business. And then recently I've kind of been involved in TV and various interactive media and just put in motion to the things I've been doing still pictures with all along.
And hey, I want to jump in. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick, everyone. You know, just in case you end up missing the program today or your connection cuts out, we're going to have this whole thing recorded with Russell Graves on our YouTube channel. So it should be up there, in the next couple days, just in case you get cut off. But this is a great presentation.
And Russ, like I said, I may need you to help me because I'm having a little bit of, okay, there we go. I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing the questions as they kind of go along because my mouse doesn't work. Okay, so here's tip number one. Watch everyone else and then do something different. I tell that to people all the time, whether we're on trips with Backcountry Journeys or whether I'm just out with someone just one-on-one. If we look at the last slide, this is from Bosque del Apache. This was from a trip I took on my own. But Bosque del Apache or Yellowstone or one of the other national parks you'll go to, you'll see just scores of people, dozens, sometimes if not hundreds of people, all lined up side by side, standing up with their camera, and they're all taking the exact same shot. And one thing I'm an advocate of is, sometimes that shot's nice, but once you get the shot everyone else has, start kind of exploring it and looking at different options and different angles. I can recall, Russ, you remember this, we were in Yellowstone National Park and we saw a bear off the side of the road there by the crossing the bridge at Yellowstone River going into the Lamar Valley. And virtually everyone was standing on the side of the bridge taking that picture. And we took our group down a little different angle and set them on the ground, and they got a lot better angle shots to the bear and a lot more face shots than anyone else was getting. And it's just because we were watching what the crowd was doing and then we were doing something different. Here's a good example here of this white-tailed buck making a scrape. This was on a trip last fall in the Smoky Mountain National Park when everyone was when the crowds were focused on 2 or 3 does that were standing on the side of the road. On the other side of the road, I did one simple thing that made the difference for our group is I turned around and looked behind me. Everyone else was focused on one thing. I turned around and looked behind me, and this buck came out of the draw and started making a scrape right behind us. And we were the only ones out of those 20 people or so that were taking pictures of deer that got this particular picture here. And it was just, again, tip number one. It's so important. It seems so obvious, but sometimes when you get caught up in the moment, it may not be obvious because we have a tendency as photographers to almost, in a way, I don't mean this to be negative, but almost like sheep, where you see one person stops and then you get right beside them, and then the next person stops and they see 2 people that are standing there, so they're gonna get right beside them, and people just keep following along the same lines. And again, I'm an advocate of just looking somewhere different. Perfect example though, we all got a great shot of this buck, and just by turning around and looking a different way. And then another,
I think, and Russ, I think that's definitely true with photographers. I mean, it's because we all want the shot, right? We're all after getting the image, and when you see other people out there and they're focused on something, it's hard not to want to kind of jump on the bandwagon and join in that so you can get the shot too. But gosh, I don't know. I mean, half the times I'm in national parks and I see a crowd of big lenses, say in Yellowstone, looking out at what, oftentimes they don't really know, and it's just kind of that herd mentality, and then if you drive around the corner, or if you go a little further, chances are you're going to see something completely different.
yeah, and it's so important to do. And even just changing the angle, like this picture of this killdeer that I took wading in shallow water on the edge of a pond. If I would have been like in the first, like the slide that led off this section, if I'd have been standing up to take this picture, I wouldn't have got the reflection like that. So it's just something simple, like changing my angle a little bit, sitting on the ground. And if you're physically fit enough and you want to do it, I would even advocate laying on the ground if you can, just to get even a more different angle. And as we go through this, you'll see some of those pictures I've taken. They're all at kind of different angles. And again, it's the challenge I challenge myself to do, and we'll get into a little bit more of this later too, is think about how these pictures have been taken, because I would love to take a picture of a species that no one's ever seen before. But the chances are we're all taking pictures of the same kind of animals that hundreds of or thousands or tens of thousands of images have been made just like it before. And so the challenge was think a little bit differently about it. And what are some ways that you can shoot the same thing in a different way? And my killdeer picture, that was a way of doing that. Is I knew those killdeer were going to be there because I'd scouted the area. And I went out one morning and sat in a blind and was able to get this shot. I think we have a question that just popped up by Angela. I see that Sandra lived in Fort Worth for many years. Welcome, fellow Texan. I can't, can you read that question to me, Russ? From Angela?
Yeah, it says, I got discouraged by other photographers taking the same shots. What inspires you to keep making pictures?
Okay, yeah, I'm going to get into that. I think it's slide 2. I'll get or section 2. I'll get into that. But I'll tell you some ways I continue to get inspired and just be able to think differently. And I'll get to that here in a second. And again, another
Yeah,
way,
and Russ,
another.
too,
Oh, go ahead.
just usually the way we do this is at the end. You know, it's because it's kind of hard to catch to field all the questions as they come in. Usually the way I do it is I take them at the end. So, but it's up to you.
Okay, no,
Just
no.
I know you.
Okay, we can do it at the end then. Okay, thank you for saying that. Another way of thinking about things differently is, one of the things I try to do a lot is to try to shoot using various shutter speeds or various techniques, because I've literally got thousands of quality images of elk. And so one of my first thoughts is you can see the cow on the left-hand side of this frame, but when this bull elk started running after the cow, I immediately thought, I'm going to try to get a slow shutter speed. And I shot this at about 1/15th of a second. I could look back at the ISO. I don't remember the ISO. Probably the ISO was 100 to 640 because that's usually the range I shoot at. But I remember I stopped down a little bit, probably f8, f11, just to get that low shutter speed. And I shoot an aperture priority most of the time, and was just able to track that elk as it was running. And really, the key is, to me, what makes this picture work is you've got all the motion blur behind the animal. You've got motion blur in the leg and a little bit in the antlers, but the eye is pretty dang sharp. So, but again, that's the same thing. Everyone else is trying to shoot that on the fast shutter speed and freeze motion. My first thought was, let's try to get it in slow motion because I've got, or let's try to blur the motion because I've got plenty of pictures as these animals frozen as they're running. Let's try to do something a little more interesting.
Russell, that's an awesome shot. Maybe I missed this. Where'd you take that?
Rocky Mountain National Park.
Okay, that was Rocky. Cool.
Yeah.
Great image.
Thanks. And then tip number 2, I think this kind of speaks to a little bit of Angela's question earlier about how do I come up with a inspiration. And tip number 2 is this is kind of how I keep a creative edge. And there's a few things in here that you might surprise you. Number 1, I read lots of magazines. When I learned to take pictures, I learned, I was a teenager when I got my first camera and shooting film. And when I learned to take pictures, I saw one technique that really struck me, and it was in Sports Illustrated magazine. And I'm not talking about the swimsuit edition. I read that edition for a whole other set of reasons than the regular sports sections. But the sports part, they'd show a picture of like Nolan Ryan, and he's throwing a pitch from the pitcher's mound, and he would be perfectly in focus, and the background be just this beautiful, creamy out of focus. And I didn't know what it was called at the time, and I didn't know how to do it. I just knew it looked cool. And so reading Sports Illustrated magazine is what got me started in doing photography. I grew up in the country. I lived on a small cattle ranch. I was around nature all the time. Grew up in a hunting and fishing family. And so I knew I loved wildlife. I loved nature. I loved being around it. I knew I wanted to get good pictures of it. But what got me my start is reading like Sports Illustrated magazine. I still read lots of magazines and look at what other people are doing. I'll read everything from bridal magazines because to me, the bridal photography that people do, the high end, is about as good and creative a photography as being made today. And so I'll read a lot of those magazines just to stay, just if I've got to do people pictures, just to kind of inspire me on how to shoot pictures of people that kind of transcend what I've ever done before. I'll still read Outdoor Photographer magazine and look at what other people are doing. I'll read some of the nature magazines that you'll see, like National Wildlife magazine or the Audubon's magazine, and see what people are doing. I'll read architectural and home improvement magazines because good photography is good photography, no matter what you're taking a picture of. And so, again, one of the things I do to keep me inspired and keep a creative edge is I read lots of magazines and then adapt little things I see in different pictures that I like and try to think, how can I incorporate those into my wildlife and nature photography? And then another thing I do, which is obviously easier today, is follow others' work. I know on Instagram and Facebook, there's a few photographers I follow, and this is kind of a double-edged sword in my mind. When I follow others' work, I'll look at photographers like John Hafner or David Lloyd and kind of see what they're doing, and not try to copy their style, but try to adapt their style. And I know people do the same thing with me as well. But it's a double-edged sword, because one of the things you never want to get caught in a trap of doing is looking at other people's work and start thinking, man, why can't I do that? Because you can. I'm guilty of it in the past too, Russ, where you'll look at something someone else is doing and it's just phenomenal work, and you start kind of doubting yourself, thinking, man, why, it's crazy. I should be able to do that, but I can't. Why am I not accomplishing what these people are accomplishing? Well, the fact is you can, and that's where it's a double-edged sword. So I'll follow people's work, but it's with a little sprinkling of, I follow it just from an artistic standpoint, and I never try to compare myself to what they're doing. Because if you do that, that's a rabbit hole that's hard to get out of, and it ultimately is discouraging. And then get the input of others. One of the things that I do, and because, when you post a lot of images on Instagram or Facebook or any other social media medium, I think it's rare, and Kenton and Russ back me up on this. I think it's rare if people ever say anything bad about your pictures. And so sort of the input I get from others is, how many likes do I get? Or how many comments do I get? And likes are fine, but I really like it when I get people's comments. And what are they saying about it? And I can track. If I'll put an image up and it gets a lot of comments, I knew people liked the image. If I put an image up and it people didn't comment much, I try to figure out, what is it about this image? Is it too plain? Is it something that's been seen too many times? Why is it not getting the kind of interaction that it should? And so when I ask the input of others, I mean, that's precisely kind of how I get it. And I've got a close circle of friends that I'll run pictures by and say, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think how do you think I'm trying to, or what do you think of what I'm trying to accomplish? And I think it really helps me kind of hone what I'm doing. Russ?
Can I jump in there real quick?
Yeah.
I got something on that,
Yeah.
Russell. As far regarding getting the input of others, I mean, I think for me, I think one of the most valuable things you can do is to submit your images to some sort of review or critique. And I personally, I love just looking at images. For example, yesterday, we had our image review session, and I mean, just submitting some of your own images, and then just being there and just watching a variety of images, getting their compositions critiqued is such a powerful way to get better at photography. I mean, to really understand what you're doing, because the goal in that, isn't to blow smoke up your, it's to make you a better photographer. It's to because the reviewers are analyzing, they're really looking at, what could you have done different in this image to make it better? Certainly, they're going to point out the good, the parts that do work. But yeah, I mean, I just think that's just one of the most powerful things we can do as photographers. And then one more note on that. There was a site, I haven't used it much recently, but I really used to enjoy the site 500px. So for those of you listening, 500px.com, and we're not affiliated with them in any way, shape, or form, but it was a great way just to get feedback on your images. People would leave realistic comments, and then of course it has a like heart system, kind of like your social medias, but that was a good one to use.
Yeah, and too, and again, on getting the input of others, I need to point out too that you also don't need to tie up your self-esteem and how many likes you get, because that's never a good thing. It's kind of like following others' work. Don't, just because you're not getting a lot of likes, don't let that discourage you at all. And I know I kind of take the likes with a little bit of grain of salt, because sometimes people just may not be looking. That may be why they're not liking. So, but again, it's always like Russ said, it's good to get the input of others, because as photographers, we're visual people anyway. We're visually oriented. I learned to take pictures by looking at other people's pictures. I mean, that's how I got started. Again, I mentioned the Sports Illustrated a minute ago. I would look at those pictures when I was a kid, a teenager, and I would see how pictures were taken, and I would try to go out with my film camera and deconstruct. How did they do that? How did they accomplish that? And I would, this is pre-internet, so I would go to the library and check out books and read books on photography and try to deconstruct images they did. And so you're right. The image critiques are really valuable to be able to be a part of.
We live in a really interesting time as photographers right now because, with the power of the internet and just in social media, the availability for all of us to look at imagery and to kind of see what everybody else is doing and to evaluate their work and compare with ours and just to kind of look at what else is out there. I actually think it's propelling the craft and the art of photography forward. I mean, the quality of work you're seeing out there these days is just incredible, even compared to just 10 years ago. It's really amazing what people are doing these days who decide to really pick up a camera and really pursue photography, as a passion. I mean,
we kind of live in the good old days of photography right now, because you're right. And really, those people who are pushing the cutting edge on image making, that's kind of what gives me my inspiration as well. And then the fourth thing on keeping the creative edge is, this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but man, it works for me. I'll put my camera away for a while every year, because I shoot professionally, and it gets to be where it's just a job. And I can even notice it in myself, where you'll show up at a shoot, no matter what that shoot is, and you just get formulaic. I'm going to take this picture, this picture, this picture, this picture, this picture, then I'm done. And and if I've been taking a lot of pictures, it starts to stifle my creativity. I'm not using my brain to think. I'm just using the camera as like a hammer. If I was putting nails into a board, I'm just hammering those nails into the board each time just to get that job accomplished, and I'm not thinking too much about it. So every year, usually from about mid-December till about mid-February, I kind of just put it away for a while and focus on family stuff and focus on my business stuff and focus on some of the things we talked about earlier, like reading lots of magazines and trying to get inspired again. And when I put my camera away for a while, I've noticed that once you start kind of still be engaged, read about it, think about it a lot, think about taking pictures, that's when those good ideas start to pop in my head about how I can take pictures that are a little bit different than what everyone else is taking.
And honestly, on that note too, that's something you can do on a trip as well. I mean, I noticed that so often on all of our Backcountry Journeys trips, whether you're out in Yellowstone or some national park, if you're in Glacier, everyone's so hyper focused on the photography that sometimes it's important just to put the camera down even momentarily and just look. And I don't know, personally, I think that energizes me massively.
Yeah, and it's the proverbial, I fail to see the forest for the trees. And
Right.
so once you kind of put it away and slow down for a little bit, it helps me a lot. And when I put the camera away, I start thinking of taking pictures like this. Like, I had a thought in my mind one day. I'm gonna brag on myself just a little bit right now. I may have the nation's best collection of wild hog images, and I'm always looking for ways to take different pictures of wild pig images. And this is one. This picture is a little soft. I think it, because I've opened and saved this presentation so much. That one looks a little soft, but believe me, the original image is sharp. I started thinking of ways, how can I get pictures of pigs that are in different light than I ever have before? So I start using my brain to think about how I can do that. You know what my solution was? I dug a hole. I knew where the pigs would be feeding. I dug a hole. I put the camera in a little bit of a hole, and then I used a remote control and stood back about 100 yards in a blind and waited for the pigs to show up. And this is the exact picture I had in my mind. I wanted a pig silhouetted against kind of not necessarily a blue sky, but just a sky, and just to get a really different kind of shot. And that's how I accomplished it. And again, it's by putting your camera away and just being re-energized and keeping a creative edge. This was another, following the work of others. I started seeing guys using camera traps. And since I've always lived in the country, we have deer that frequent the property all the time. And so I don't know if y'all can see that or not, but there's you can see the stars in the sky behind that deer. That was a typical studio setup, and I found a guy smarter than I am to build me a passive infrared sensor, and I built a housing out of an ammo box and was able to put my a DSLR in the housing and use a remote trigger to fire the flashes remotely. And then every time an animal would step in front of that camera, it would take its picture. And that's one of the shots I got from that. And so, not only deer pictures, we got pictures of pigs and raccoons and armadillos and everything else that would kind of travel those trails around our property. We're able to get pictures like that. And again, it's all got in a creative rut. I wasn't thinking right. And so I start kind of following the work of others and seeing what others are doing and just being inspired by other sources other than my own. And I love drone photography. I don't know how many people in here do that, but I think it's a underrated tool for nature photography. But this was a shot I took for a magazine last summer. And this is a center pivot irrigation system in Del City, Texas. And I thought, man, that would look so much more interesting if I shot it from about 100 feet above it. And it's just a really neat kind of graphical image that speaks a lot to, the agriculture work that I do. And it's a beautiful shot. And again, it's just thinking, I shot that from the ground, but just putting a camera in the air made a lot of difference. We're taught as photographers, everything's got to be front lit. Sun's got to be at your back, shining on the subject, but backlighting does a great job as well. And again, you just get shots like this when you start thinking about doing things differently over time. One of the things I advocate, and I think Russ, you've heard me advocate it, is when you're on these trips with Backcountry Journeys, and whether I'm on a trip with Backcountry Journeys or doing stuff on my own, I'm constantly thinking about the overarching story. There's good stories have a beginning, middle, and an end, but they've all got all these details in between that we tell each other to help round out the stories. And wildlife photography is no different. I like to try to take as many behavior shots as I can, but I'm also always on the lookout for tracks as well, because that helps tell the story of where wildlife has been and where it's going. And it's just, to me, when you're thinking about your portfolio of images, it helps round it out. And so, just again, keeping a creative edge is thinking about something as mundane as an animal track and trying to make it as beautiful as you can. And this is a turkey track. I shot this with I shoot Canon cameras. I've got a Canon 85mm f1.2 lens, and I love that lens because it's super sharp and it's got crazy out of focus areas. And that's what I shot this picture with, these turkey tracks. And from a compositional standpoint, I like this because you can see one track to define what it is, but you can see the other tracks in the distance that are out of focus, but they're just, your brain still knows what they are, and it just leads you into the photo. And another thing, keeping a creative edge, when I was taking this picture, this buck was following this doe. It was during the rut, and most people would focus on the buck, and I did take that picture, but this picture has probably been licensed for magazines probably a dozen times just because it's so different. Instead of taking a picture of the buck like most people would, I thought it was important to analyze the doe's relationship with the buck. And she was about ready to be bred, and he was following her, and she stopped for a moment to turn around because she saw me. I was in a blind, and she saw me in the blind, and then she stopped for a second to turn around and look at that buck. I don't know whether to warn him and just to see if she was still with him, but to me, that picture right there just speaks volumes. And then
that's a great image.
And then I don't know if this is smart or not, but for 25 years I lived in rattlesnake country, and I've got plenty of pictures of rattlesnakes, but thought, how can you take a picture of a rattlesnake, stay safe, and get the shot that I was thinking about? And Russ or Kenton, do y'all want to take a guess at how I did this one? And we'll kind of deconstruct this shot a little bit.
If I were to guess, Russell, knowing you, let me guess. Did you creep up really close in your ghillie suit and get as close as possible?
It was kind of a matrix move, might have been involved there as well. No, so what I did is, the snake actually didn't strike. It just opened its mouth to kind of give me a warning. I had my camera on a monopod and fired it remotely, and it doesn't look as close as what it is. Well, I'd say it's pretty close. I was probably 8 inches away from the snake when I took that picture, and that was one of those shots. I was out in the brush one day, just roaming around, found the snake. He was out sunning, and when I walked past him the first time, he did that, and that's when I thought I'm going to try to get a shot of that. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody though. So any picture you see I might have taken here, make sure you keep yourself safe. And tip number 3, I was speaking with Russ. We were having a chat on Sunday afternoon about this the other day, and this is this might be I'm not going to say this is a controversial statement, but cameras have come such a long way, and they're so good at accomplishing most of what you want. It's always important to understand why your camera's doing what it's doing, to be able to get the results that you want, especially in tricky lighting situations. I'll never underestimate the importance of I'll never understate the importance of understanding how your camera works. But I think if you're really serious about wildlife photography, tip number 3, understanding wildlife, may be as or more important than understanding everything your camera can do. I know I shoot Canon cameras. For a while last spring, Olympus sent me one of their new cameras to try out. It was the M1X Micro Four Third camera. Beautiful camera, really capable. But that camera, I bet it had 500 functions to it that you could do. Well, I really didn't need to know all 500 functions. I only needed to know how to do about 10 functions to make it work like I wanted it to. And once I did that, it goes into tip number 3, understand wildlife. And I think one of the things that's always I've had the advantage, or it's always been in my favor doing, because I grew up around wildlife, is I understand what a deer looks like when it's about to run off, or I understand what time of year a prairie chicken is going to be on a lek, or I understand, like in this picture of this barn out right here, there was a barn on a property near Childress where I used to live, that if we all loaded up and went there today, the barn, this same owl or its descendants are living in the same barn. But I knew if you walked up close to the barn, the owl would fly out, and they do the same thing all the time. It's just what owls do. This owl would fly out of one window and then make a clockwise loop around the house, and then fly and land in some trees about 50 yards away. And so I noticed that the first time, and then when I saw it the second time, I thought, well, I can get the pictures of this thing flying. So I walked up to the barn, it flew out and flew and landed in the trees, and was able to get this shot right here. And this, again, it's just understanding what wildlife's going to do. And it's understanding, like when the mule deer rut is. If you like deer like I like deer, the ruts are based on latitude, what time of year it's going to happen. So typically, the further northern latitudes you get, the earlier they're going to be in their breeding season, the earlier they're going to rut. So, for example, like a white-tailed deer, for example, in Montana, they're probably going to rut the first week in November. Well, in South Texas, they're not rutting until the last week of December. And so, because it all has to do, what triggers it has to do with the amount of daylight and the temperature both combined. And that's what triggers the rut each year. It triggers the does to go into estrus, which triggers the bucks to start exhibiting rutting behavior, like fighting and sparring, like these mule deer are here. And so by understanding that, you can increase your odds of getting good wildlife photos. I'm always a fan of saying, for me, I try to put all the things I can in my favor until the point that I just can't control them anymore. So in other words, I want to understand how my camera works, and understand I want to understand how my camera works the way I need it to work to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. And then I want to understand what the animals are doing and what's likely to be there at a given time of the year, and make sure my setup is correct, where I'm going to be in the best light, and all those things I'm trying to manage myself to put in my favor, up until the point you can't manage it, and that is anything going to show up or not? At that point, if it does show up, I'm prepared. If it doesn't show up, man, my consolation prize is I get to sit out in nature and watch everything else, kind of the world unfold. And but that's just kind of my approach to it all. And again, like this coyote shot, I'd been seeing coyote tracks, and I knew coyotes were in the area. And I was actually out trying to take pictures of turkeys this morning, and this coyote just cruised right past. And I've taken hundreds or thousands of coyote pictures, and this may be among my favorites because the light is perfect. And He's actually looking. I don't know what he was looking at, because obviously he's not looking at me. He was looking past me up another trail. So I don't even know if he knew I was there when he walked past.
Yeah, that is a fantastic shot, Russell. Wow, that's a beautiful light on that guy.
It is. And then again, when you're talking about things like lesser prairie chickens, the cool thing about prairie chickens are, if you understand their biology, every year during their breeding season, when they do their mating dance, they fly back to the same spot every year. That spot's called a lek. And for generations and for hundreds of years, or as long as we've known prairie chickens have been around, or not just prairie chickens, but sage grouse will do the same thing. They fly back to the same lek every year. And just understanding what time of year that's going to happen, and how to put yourself in position really goes a long way in help increasing your odds on getting nice wildlife photos. Same way here. Russ, do you know what kind of quail that is on the left? Because those are
I don't.
in Arizona. They're in southern Arizona, mainly in the desert areas. That's a scaled quail, or as us Texans like to call them, blue quail. But again, just understanding what time of year you're likely to see blue quail calling from the top of a limb, dead limb like that, and understanding where the quail live and where you're likely to see them, and even going a step further and figuring out where densities are the most, you can put yourself in a position to do that. And the same way with the Texas horned lizard on the right. That's a threatened species in Texas, and just it's a treat to see them. But you can find them and you can see them. It just takes a little bit of looking and understanding the biology of the animals. And I think that's the slide you advertised.
Yeah, that was on the
talk
cover.
with, right? Yeah. And that shot here was actually back in February on our winter in Yellowstone trip that we did. And I'm not going to take a lot of credit for understanding the biology of foxes and where we could likely find them, but that's where, when we hired the local guides to take us out, those guys are the ones that knew their stuff and where the likely place to see a fox would be, and took us right to the spot. And so this is a case where I didn't have to necessarily understand the wildlife, but we found someone smarter than we were at it to help us get the job done. Not only for me, I'm not the only one that took this picture. All the clients on the trip took the same picture. So from slightly different angles, because everyone, had learned the lesson to do slightly different angles, but this is a good example of that.
And I think it's a really good thing to touch on is, a lot of our trips, we do have local experts, who are there to, to kind of help with that sort of stuff. We're in Yellowstone, we've got the coach drivers, and then down in Costa Rica, we've got local guides. And that's, for some of the locations, it's just the importance is paramount. And just be able to know exactly where you're going.
Yeah, because those guys live there and they understand the nuances of the wildlife that lives there, and can maximize our opportunities. And again, it all goes back to what I said earlier about trying to put all the odds in your favor and controlling all the elements you can to the point that you can't control them anymore. In this picture, this is a good example of where you need to understand how your camera works and why you do it, because you've got a dark bird on a dark background with a strip of light running through there, and 100% of the time when you point your camera at that scene, it's going to tell you what the shutter speed and exposure. I mean, I shoot aperture priority, so I shoot I've dialed in the aperture myself, but it's going to tell you a shutter speed that's going to be a lot lower than what it really needs to be. And so in this case, you expose for the highlights, or that grass is a little lighter than mid-tone, so I expose for the grass. And when you take the picture, you're able to see the background turns dark, the feathers of the turkey are dark where they need to be, and the iridescence can shine through. And again, understanding wildlife, understanding like wild turkeys, what time of the year they're going to be exhibiting this behavior, which we're into it right now, is important. And I even went one further step. I learned the sound that if any of you guys on this talk live around turkeys, I know the sound that'll make them gobble about 80% of the time on command. And turkeys are funny that way. They shock gobble. If they hear a sound that's a little bit unfamiliar, they'll gobble at it. And I don't know why they do that, but they just do. But I found that a single, like one note whistle like that, just a real soft whistle, will make them gobble almost every time. And it's so fun to watch, and and it makes for great photographs. And then understand wildlife. Sometimes you get these unexpected shots. Like this is a flock of blackbirds that are flying near my home. And when I took the first picture, I thought, wait a second, I see something that doesn't belong. And then there it is at the bottom. These pictures, I should have uploaded new ones of this. These are a little soft, but the originals are a little sharper. I think there's something when I saved this, something went on. I should have caught that. But and then I found this bird, and this is and that's the picture I took. This is, I've never really had any pictures that I would consider went viral, but this was kind of before the whole viral mentality when I took this picture. And again, this was just understanding that blackbirds are migrating this time of year. I'm going to go out and shoot pictures of migrating blackbirds, and I found this bird amongst them. This is the leucistic yellow-headed blackbird, and at the time, according to my contacts at the Audubon Society, this was only one of two ever documented in the United States. And I got lucky enough to shoot one of them. And that got shared so much on message boards from that original photo that it's, again, before the concept of viral really took off. This was probably 10 or 12 years ago I took this picture. That's what happened, because it's such an unusual bird and such a beautiful bird at the same time. And that's that barn owl from earlier. You can do composites like this. When I took this picture, I've got two children. One is 19 and the other one is 15. But when they were younger, when I did this composite on my computer, I told them it was a flock of owls that I took pictures of, and they believed me. And I don't know if I've ever went back and told them any different, but I think they would think they'd be a little skeptical of that now. But again, that's that same owl you saw earlier, and just a composite, because again, I knew they would be, I knew which direction they would find, and I put all the odds in my favor to be able to do this shot like this. And again, same with mule deer, just understanding their nuances. Love black-tailed prairie dogs. Prairie dog's the best dog I ever had in my life, Russ.
Nice. That is a fantastic image. That is beautiful, Russell.
Yeah, that's just again using the first lesson of doing something different. This is just a low angle, shooting through the flowers, and understanding prairie dog behavior. This is a young prairie dog pup, and understanding prairie dog behavior, and just putting myself in a position to be able to get this image. And in these pictures I'm showing you guys today, there may be a couple that are largely unattainable, but most of them, it's not like I'm independently wealthy where I can just go do whatever I want to do whenever I want to do it and travel the world. These wildlife I'm showing you are pretty much all backyard wildlife, stuff that's just in my greater area. I mean, not my immediate area. Like there's no prairie dogs where I live now, but if I travel 2.5 hours away, I can take this same picture again, because this was in the Wichita National Wildlife Refuge. And a lot of the pictures that you've seen today are on private land, but I'll share a little bit about it with you in a little bit on how to get access to private land if that's something you've always been interested in.
Was this image here? Do you remember? Was this shot with the Canon 500mm f4?
I think that one was shot with the Olympus, that Micro Four Thirds. That was one I shot last spring when I had that camera.
Just curious. I mean, a lot of your backgrounds are phenomenal. Like your bokeh is just beautiful on a lot of these.
Yeah, so a lot of that is, yeah, I'll show you going forward. I'll go back to where I was. A lot of that, and that's a good point, and a lot of it is, again, one of those things of thinking, how can I get the look I'm trying to accomplish? And one of the ways you get those real soft, out of focus backgrounds, or two ways, is you shoot with your lenses wide open. Again, that's why I almost always shoot aperture priority, because I can do my exposure compensation. I'm adept enough at using my camera. I can do the exposure compensation to be able to kind of adjust the over or underexpose as needed. But really for me, the backgrounds are super important. And so in this picture, open my aperture wide open, and then the further you can have the background away from your subject, the more out of focus it's going to be. So if I would have been at a higher angle, the background relative to the subject would have been closer. And so you wouldn't have got this creamy background. But just by getting lower in that perspective, the background's further away in the back, and so that's how you get those really soft, out of focus. It's just paying attention to the background. Same way
Yeah.
here. Oh, go ahead.
And
I'm
for
sorry.
those of you who don't know, shooting wide open just means shooting at your widest maximum aperture. So if your widest aperture on your lens is f4, shooting wide open would be at f4. If your widest aperture is say f.28, that would be shooting
Yeah.
wide open.
Thank you for clarifying that. And one of the downsides of shooting wide open, you got to really pay attention to your shutter speed. I know my Canons will shoot a top shutter speed of 0.008 of a second. And sometimes because I do shoot wide open in brighter sunlight, you may exceed what the camera's able to catch. So I have to drop my ISO to like 100. And that's why I usually shoot in that sweet spot of 1 to 640. I mentioned that earlier, is because even if the sun's getting up and it's getting a little brighter, I can still maintain that shutter speed that'll be able to capture that image by using that wide open aperture that I'm using. And that's a great horned owl I spooked up. Beautiful eyes on those things.
Yeah.
That was with the 500mm lens.
I love owl photography. They're just some of the coolest looking creatures when you can nail that perfect shot. Owls are just their facial expressions and their wings are just, there's something about owls that I don't know. We should really do an owl trip, an owl specific trip.
They're fun. Has anyone ever seen a stack of bats before? That's why I want to throw that in there. It's not every day you see a stack of bats, but I found one in a cave and I had to take a picture of it. And I'm looking at the time. I'm gonna go through these a little quicker.
Cool.
Look at this picture. Look at and someone pointed this out to me. I'd never seen this before, but look at the water. It almost looks like a ballerina touching the turkeys. Can y'all see that? Looks like a little person
Yeah.
down there. And tip number 4, hit a back road. You know, I'd have to go back and count, but I would say a good quarter of the pictures that I've shown y'all today so far, and the pictures I'm about to show you now, have all been taken out of the front seat of my pickup. And so one of the things I do when I don't have somewhere else to be, I'm an early riser anyway. A lot of times I'll just get in my truck and I'll go drive a back road early in the morning and just see what I can see. A lot of times I don't see anything, but sometimes you get gems like the ones we're looking at here, like this mule deer buck who thought he was hiding behind this mesquite tree when I shot its picture. Or the porcupine in the tree on the left, or this leucistic burrowing owl that I found. Just this was right off a highway that I'm driving down the road, and I looked. I mean, my camera is like my American Express card. I don't leave home without it, and so I'm driving down the road, and I see that burrowing owl, and I knew something looked different about it, and it was a leucistic burrowing owl on the side of the road, standing on a fence post. Or a bobwhite quail. That's just, again, I mean, I'm on a public road, dirt road, county road, and I see this bird calling from the side, or the sparrow catching worms. This was on a dirt road between 2 ranches, and in 1996, biologists in Texas declared the swift fox extinct in the state. There were no more. And fast forward 15 years later, I'm driving down the road and I see, driving pretty slow, and I see out in a prairie dog town what I thought were 5 baby coyotes out there. And so when I looked at them, I realized that those aren't coyotes, those are foxes. And so I squeaked at one to my lips, just like you'd call your dog, made that sound. And that fox ran right at the truck. And I was able to shoot pictures of it.
Beautiful.
And that was the first time swift foxes have been documented in Texas since like 1994. I love those boat-tailed grackles. They're beautiful birds, and they'll call from fence posts. Yeah, driving down the road one day, looked alongside the road and there's a porcupine walking. So I got out and laid on the ground and was eye to eye with the porcupine while I shot pictures of him. That on a side note, with this coronavirus going around and the social distancing we're all having to practice, Russ, my beard is starting to look like that porcupine. I
You
need,
know,
I need to go get it trimmed.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I've been sitting here. We've been spending so much time on the computer doing these webinars, and of course, we're here developing all these various online courses for people to do during this time. I haven't shaved in weeks. I'm the same way.
Yeah,
It's a good thing we're not showing you our faces on camera today, folks.
I know it'd be scary. Or this 9-banded armadillo. Again, this is one of those times driving down the road, I see an armadillo in the ditch. I park, get out, lay on the ground. Understanding armadillos, it goes back to that understanding wildlife. They can't see that well, and so, but they can smell really good. And so I knew if I didn't get upwind from it where he couldn't smell me, he'd walk right past me, and that's what he did there. And I just laid on the ground, feet from my truck, and he walked right past me across the ditch. That's a nice white-tailed buck I saw driving around one time in a field, standing out in the field. And by the way, if you were wondering,
Nice.
deer they can read street signs. And then tip number 5, and this is a big question I get a lot of times. People will say, "How do you get so much access to private land that you get?" And because in Texas, we almost don't have a choice. Texas is 98% privately owned, and so all these private landowners have all this fabulous wildlife habitat. And so that's kind of I didn't go to a national park. My first national park visit was Yellowstone when I was 29 years old. But so I learned to take pictures on private land. And the big question I get a lot, especially in Texas when I'm doing these presentations, are how do you get access? And it's pretty simple. I just ask. And typically, once you get to know someone a little bit and you ask, that goes a long way in tip number 5 in help building a network. And when you build a network, you've got a set of eyes and ears that are out in the field for you every day, and they're telling you things like, "Man, I've been seeing this big bobcat hanging out by my barn. You ought to come see if you can take a picture of it." Or, "I've got these turkeys that come into my side yard every day, and they'll just fight and cause all kinds of ruckus, and you ought to see if you can come take a picture of it." This, you can tell this was in someone's yard. These turkeys roosted near their house, and then because they kept bird feed out, those turkeys would come to the yard every morning, eat a little breakfast, and then cause a ruckus like this. But what I love is look at the body language of all of them in the back. I mean, the one, like the two that are leaping, look at the one below him on the left. He's all bowed up, and then the one standing on the right, he's got kind of a cocky look on his face too. And that's one of my favorite turkey pictures I've ever taken. Or if you do go on national or public land, this was at the National Bison Range, I guess north of Missoula, Montana, south of Kalispell, where I've got a guy there that's there a lot of the times in the fall, and he called me. He knew I was going to be in the area. He's like, "Man, you need to make some time. I've been seeing some nice elk out every day. You need to make some time to come up here and we'll go photograph." And that's what I did, and that's all part of building a network. So a lot of what I'm able to accomplish is I don't accomplish it on my own. I use kind of my loose team that I've got, my eyes in the field who are looking. And sometimes I have to use those contacts professionally because this was in a little bitty out of the way place called Maljavar, New Mexico, and in the sandhills out there. And I had to photograph a really obscure species of lizard for a magazine, and it was called the Dune sagebrush lizard. And the thing about the Dune sagebrush lizard is, if this lizard would have been listed as an endangered species, it would have curtailed oil exploration in the most active oil exploration region in the entire country, if not the world, and that's the Permian Basin of Texas and New Mexico. And so for a while, when the feds were considering making this lizard an endangered species, the big question was, because they didn't have good models to know how, was the lizard ever plentiful, or was it one of those species there was just never very many of them? And they were trying to answer the question, is oil exploration really making much of a difference on them? And so I had to go out and shoot pictures of this. Well, how do you find a literal needle in a haystack when you know kind of the area they live in, but this lizard is 6 inches long and you've got to go out and find it. And that's where you start building your network. And so through what I've done, I know some wildlife biologists, and I started asking questions. Does anybody know about these lizards? Which led me to this guy who was the only biologist in America who was trying to study whether or not these lizards were ever plentiful in the range that they were found or not. And so he was doing research every day on them. And so I made contact with him through a mutual friend, called him up and said, hey, do you think we can get pictures of lizards? He's like, if you can find Malamar, New Mexico, I can get you pictures of lizards. So away I went, and we were able to get shots of this dune sagebrush lizard. That's one shot there, and then that's my favorite shot of them right there. And they just live in one little pocket, one little isolated pocket of the world, and it's about probably a 10-county area in far west Texas and far southeastern New Mexico. But again, it's by doing tip number 5 and using my network. And it's 12:56, Russ, so I'm gonna wind down a little bit and we'll entertain questions. I want to tell you a little bit about a couple things I've got coming up soon. I've got an upcoming book, and I think it may drop next week, Russ. If not, the week after. It's the Big Book of Digital Nature Photography. Nature Photographer. I have a misspelling there, so forgive me. I don't think there's that egregious a misspelling in the book, but I had a misspelling there. But the Big Book of Digital Nature Photography. It's about 60,000 words, or it's a little more than 60,000 words. Hour and a half worth of video, and I can't remember, a couple of hundred pictures, 200 to 300 pictures with technical information on each one. Tells you the camera I use, the lens I use, the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO combination. Even tells you the area I took the picture, so if you're wondering where it was taken. So it's chock full of information, and it's going to be in ebook format. And so be looking out for some of that stuff. And then one of the things I'm working on now is the reason I'm moving the land we bought. We call it Hackberry Farm, and soon that will be a pretty nice place to do wildlife photography, everywhere from hummingbirds to songbirds to waterfowl, and hopefully some bigger animals like white-tailed deer and wild pigs and all the other critters that live in North Texas. So we're pretty excited about that as well. And then if you have some questions beyond this presentation, there's my website address, and feel free to contact me at russell@russellgraves.com. Sometimes it may take me a day or two, but I answer 100% of the questions I get. And so I'd love to hear what you have on your mind. And again, if you have any questions about any of these pictures, once you've watched this presentation back again, if you have any questions about how I'm editing these pictures, please let me know. And thanks for that. And Russell, Russ, do you want to start going through the questions and helping me with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go through these questions here real quick. And I just want to remind everybody too, also we're going to be when Russell's book finally comes out, we're going to be look at our email list, look at everything, because the Backcountry Journeys has, because we're going to be announcing that as well on our channel. So if you follow us on social media, you can definitely you'll have access to that right away. So, and then the other thing is tomorrow, you're doing your presentation on Friday, and then tomorrow we have Matt Meisenheimer's full Photoshop course. So we're doing Wednesday and Thursday from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's a full online Photoshop beginner to intermediate workshop. It'll take you from 0 to hero in a very short period of time. And you can register for that on our website. And if you can't make the whole thing, it's going to also be available as a recorded module. So you can, even if you can't sit through the whole live program, you can get it after the fact and kind of watch it as your leisure online. So Russell, we can see your whole screen now.
Okay. So you know. Yeah, I was trying to get the questions where I could see them.
Okay, I got the questions.
Because for some reason this webinar software, when I make my screen big to go through the presentation, I lose my mouse capabilities. So I can't enlarge the questions to be able to see them.
Okay. Yeah, I've got the dual screen thing going on here.
Okay.
So one question I want to touch on. So from Angela, Angela wants to know, and I'm going to ask you to clarify this a little bit for us, Angela. She wants to know if I can only afford one extra lens, what would you recommend? So will you let us know what you're shooting with and also what you have currently? Because it's sort of tough. There's such a wide variety of gear and lenses out there. Let us know what you have so far. We'll try to touch on that one. We'll try to get back to that one. One question that would be probably a good one for you, Russell, is how did you get started? Or how does one get started submitting content to magazines?
Well, that's a good question, and that's a question I get a lot of times. It's one of the things you got to understand is how magazines work. Magazines are all segmented. There's someone who's looking at the words and editing them. Well, just like they have a word editor, most magazines have a photo editor or an art director. And so it's what I did in the beginning was you start to, at least from a correspondent standpoint, you get to know who the art director or photo editor of a magazine is. And then initially what I did was start saying, do y'all have any like holes in your editorial coverage you're looking to do? And you find out a lot of magazines have what they'll send out for every issue are wants lists. And that's just a list of photos that they know the stories that are coming up, and they're looking for photos of bobcats or elk or whatever, or this particular location based on the magazine you're looking for. And then they'll send those out. And then initially what I would do is just kind of go through my portfolio and find the images that fit what they needed and would send them in. And that was the early days. It was slides, and it was a lot more cumbersome, a lot easier with digital, but I would just try to match up to those needs. Well, as my portfolio grew and I became, things shifted for me over time. I didn't have to respond to them. They started reaching out to me. And that's just the way business typically works is you make a relationship with someone, you prove your capabilities and what they can do, and then they start reaching out to you instead of having to it's a difference between push marketing and pull marketing. And so, but what I would recommend to anybody that's wanting to get started in magazines, the prognosticators told us that magazines were going to die 20 or 25 years ago because of digital technologies. But has anyone been in a Barnes and Noble lately? I mean, there's more magazines today than there ever has been. And so what I usually try to do is every time I go to a Barnes and Noble, I'll pick up a few different magazines that I haven't ever worked for before and try to start the same relationship over with them again, find the photo editor, send them an email, ask the questions, ask what they need, and hopefully make a connection. And I can tell you, it usually takes me about 5 or 6 times of tapping them on the shoulder before we ever make a connection. But my recommendations to everyone is start with those regional magazines or state magazines that and you may have coverage of, and make a relationship with that photo editor and just see what they need and start trying to respond to their call for photos.
Nice. So next question. Well, what metering mode do you usually use, Russell? And the question asks, is it spot metering?
No, typically I use just that. Oh gosh, I went blank. What does Canon call it? The evaluative metering. Yeah. Typically I just use that. That works. That'll get me in the ballpark about what I want to do. Typically, it's pretty close. It's those cameras are getting better and better every year, but it's fairly close to what I want to do. Here's why I don't ever change the metering mode, and this is such a weak reason, but it's my reason, so I'm sticking with it, is that if I ever change metering mode, a lot of times I forget to change it back, and I miss some shots. And so what I've learned to do is on aperture priority on my cameras is just learn to do the exposure adjustment, and it's pretty simple. If it's a dark background, I'll raise the shutter speed and stop. Do a +1 or -1. If it's a light background like snow, I'll do a +1 and add light to the image. And so
yes, so exposure.
Yeah, just do exposure compensation, and that's all based off evaluative metering.
Yeah. I use the spot metering from time to time, but I mean that's the thing, especially when you've got really high contrast areas like like a snow scene, for example, or a water scene, wildlife on water. The spot meter can come in handy, especially if you use it in conjunction with your exposure compensation. That can be a really valuable tool to use.
Yeah.
We've got, let's see, so we've got a question about shooting wide open from Jeanette, and asking, isn't shooting wide open usually one of the more softer areas on the lens? And I can answer that one, Jeanette. Yeah, it is typically. And so, but there's value in it too. And as wildlife photographers, typically, we're challenged with a set of sort of like environmental challenges that we're dealing with. So you've got, you're typically shooting at high shutter speeds and low light. So meaning, you've got to get that light in there to get your proper exposure one way or another. And so oftentimes, if you're trying to capture fast movement of wildlife, and it's early morning and it's dark, you really have no option except for shooting at your widest maximum aperture, because you need to let that light in. But at the same time, let's say you're at a thousandth of a shutter speed or even higher for bird photography. You're talking high shutter speed and high ISO, and that's just the reality of a wildlife photographer. In a perfect world, say on a brightly lit day, yeah, the better choice is probably to shoot towards the middle of your lens. And all lenses are different, but typically typically your lenses are going to be sharper in the middle of their range. So f8, f11, that area of a lens is typically going to be your sharper area of your lens. But we were talking about earlier, we were talking about backgrounds and bokeh, and Russell's images just have this amazing bokeh quality to them. And so, that's something you are going to get with a wider aperture.
Yeah, I think I can see one of the questions here. I think we skipped by Sandra Swanson. It says, what type of blind do you use, and do you have a recommendation? The type of blinds that I'm fond of using, you can buy for about $100 at like a Bass Pro Shops or Cabela's or Shields or Dick's Sporting Good or any of the sporting goods stores, and they're just a little portable pop-up blind that's used for hunting. If I'd have been smarter, I told my wife a few years ago that someone ought to invent a blind like these for photographers, a pop-up blind that's light and easy to carry and sets up and tears down quick. And lo and behold, someone did. I've been anxious to try a fairly new company. It's called Tragopan, Tragopan photography blinds. Terrible name, but it looks like they did everything that I would do to make a photography blind, in that they've got some sleeves for the lenses when you put them out the ports, and they're made for tripod legs. If you use a hunting blind, they're made for hunting, so they're not made for photographers, so it's a specific type of just single person pop-up blind. And I'm looking at one right now. Actually, I told you wrong. Cabela's and Bass Pros has one called the Pursuit blind, and it's $70, and that's what I use. And again, they come in a little backpack, and you can carry them. They weigh 6 or 8 pounds, really light. And when I'm doing private land photography, most of the time, that's what I'll take in and take out. And in Texas, some state parks will allow you to use blinds, and so if I'm ever in a state park photographing something, that's what I'll use, because they're unobtrusive. They don't, they're quiet. If you're in a little bit of wind, they don't work very well, but if it's a quiet, still day, it works pretty phenomenal, especially for birds. Mammals notice blinds more than birds do, but I was taking some pictures of some wild turkeys. There's about 50 of them in a flock in the bottom of a dried out farm pond, and a gust of wind blew, and it blew the blind off of me. It just flipped it right off the back of me. So I'm sitting there in shorts and a t-shirt with a camera on a tripod, and I've got 50 sets of eyes that are 30 yards away that are staring back at me like, where'd that guy come from? And the only thing I knew to do was I turned around and grabbed the blind and just pulled it back over the top of me. And right when I did that, it's like I disappeared and I was never there. They instantly forgot about me and went back to doing what they were doing. And so
I think
blinds
there's a scene like that. Yeah. There's a scene like that in the Lord of the Rings, isn't there, where the Hobbit pulls the magic cape over him and the
It was kind of like that, exactly.
Question from Lynn, similar to the one we just had a minute ago, about she says a lot of wildlife activity is early in the morning and late afternoon. How do you work in low light situations? I usually shoot with wide open aperture, but then end up having to raise the ISO higher than I'd like. And Lynn, welcome to the world of spending a lot of money, because that's a tried and true problem, and that's just the reality of the situation. In that sense, do your best, and ultimately it usually leads for most photographers to purchasing more expensive lenses and full frame cameras. I'm not sure what you're shooting with, but typically I usually steer people towards getting a full frame camera at that point. And then if your noise levels are still higher than you like, you're getting into the realm of using like post processing to remove digital noise.
Yeah, and I'm an advocate too of every piece of camera equipment I own, I bought it used. And so I was looking the other day on KEH.com, and they've got, affordable is relative, but they have some big glass lenses on there that are half price of what you'd have to buy them new when they were brand new. And typically KEH, the stuff is, they check it out, they make sure it works. And look, I'm not sponsored by KEH. That's just where I buy from. But I know B&H Photo does it too. But a lot of times you can get really good deals on some big glass, some really wide open or really wide aperture lenses if you buy them used, if you're comfortable with that. And I've always have been, so I've always had good luck with buying used equipment.
I'm going to touch on Angela's question here real quick about she wanted to know which is the best lens, and she's got a Sony DSLR setup. So if you're looking for kind of a one-stop shop telephoto lens, Sony just came out with a beautiful new 100-400 lens. It's very similar to Canon's. It's got phenomenal Canon has a tried and true 100-400 series that they're always sort of their Mark II the version is just excellent. But Sony's is very nearly identical, really. And so that would probably be the one I'd recommend for you, with 100-400, because that'll give you a lot of flexibility. You can shoot at 100 millimeters, and you can also shoot up to 400 millimeters. And then to couple with that, if you want to, you can add a teleconverter to that. And teleconverters are, it's a personal choice. They do tend to soften images a little bit. It really just depends on the lighting and also the specific teleconverter. Nowadays, the newer teleconverters are certainly a lot better. Like, I know Canon's Mark III 1.4 times teleconverter is just head over heels better than the previous one. It's about $500, I believe. At least it was. Maybe it's come down in price, but yeah. So that'd be my recommendation, is to get a teleconverter with the 100-400. And then we have another similar question from Angela S., who asks, just overall wanting to know best lenses for wildlife. She's on our Katmai trip in September, and shooting with a Canon 6D Mark II, wanting to know what our thoughts are between the Canon 100-400 and the Sigma 100-600. Tough question. There's benefits of both, and so obviously with the Sigma, you've got longer reach. However, what typically happens with those lenses with longer reach, if you're comparing a Sigma to the Canon, I do think the Canon's going to have a little bit better image quality. Tell me if you disagree, Russell, but you are limited. You're missing out on that extra 200 millimeters of reach. But if it were my choice, I would probably, in this particular situation, I would go, if I'm shooting on a Canon body, I would choose the 100-400 over the Sigma, just simply due to the image quality. The Canon 100-400 Mark II is just a remarkable lens. And then if you wanted to, you could add that teleconverter as well.
Yeah, the 1.4, and that'd make it 560, almost 600. So that would be a pretty sweet setup. And yeah, that's the one lens that I've never bought that I keep telling myself I need to buy, because that is a good lens. I see where Pat asked if I still use the Olympus camera. Pat, I don't use that Olympus camera. man, they sent that to me. It was a great camera. In fact, if you go on the Backcountry Journeys Tribe Facebook page, you'll see a video about Yellowstone Spring that I shot with that camera. And love the video functions of it, loved everything about it, loved the size of it. But there are two issues that came to mind. One has everything to do with the camera, and one has nothing to do with the camera. And the thing that everything had to do with it is that you can kind of see my signature sort of out of focus backgrounds that I like to get with that f4, that 300 millimeter f4 lens, which is about a 600 millimeter equivalent, and the micro four thirds sensor. I couldn't get that same look all the time that I wanted with that I could achieve with the Canon. But the second reason I didn't stick with that camera, and I may end up buying it for its video capabilities only, but the second reason I didn't stick with that camera is because it's, you know, I have a business and it's what I do for a living. And so one of the elemental rules of business is you can't always control how much you make, but you can always control how much you spend. And so I looked at all my gear, and if I sold all my Canon gear, and if I sold it, how much would I get for it, and how much would I have to invest in getting a mirrorless camera through Olympus? And it made more sense to me just to wait it out. Canon's coming up, they're coming out. They just came out with a great new body, the 1DX Mark III, that I'm going to try to pick up when it starts coming on the used market, as well as the a pro level mirrorless camera that I'll end up picking up. And that way I can still use all my same lenses, and it will be less of an effect on my pocketbook, because I mentioned earlier I got a 19-year-old daughter and she's in college, so I got to save all the pennies I can.
Nice. Let's see. So, question for you, Russell. Love your presentation. What program or template are you using to create the borders on your photos?
So that is, I use Keynote. I use Mac computers, and Keynote is their I guess their is analogous to PowerPoint, and so I just use that, and that was just one of the stock templates that they have inside of Keynote.
And then another one for you. How much of your final images are adjusted in Photoshop?
Not much, you know, and a lot of that comes back from when I started. When I first started, I learned on film, and the first film I started shooting when I started doing pictures for magazines was Kodachrome 64. And I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with film, but 64 meant it was ISO 64. And then I eventually switched up to Fuji Velvia 100 speed film. And when you're a young photographer and you're trying to make a living doing it, every time you push the button on that camera, it's painful, because it's like you can hear a cash register ring every time you push the button back in the day. Because for a roll of 36 pictures for film and processing, it cost me about $12 back in the day to take 36 pictures for film and processing. And so I learned early on, I just can't afford to make many mistakes. So I really learned camera operations just by trying to get it right, doing it in film. And so even with digital, I got a little more latitude, but for the most part, I would say that these images you see are 90 to 95% of the way they came out of the camera. And the reason why they're not 100% is because I shoot on RAW, and RAW you always have to color correct a little bit. But I rarely use Photoshop at all. I use Lightroom to manage my images, but yeah, most of them I just try to get it right in the camera and get it as close as I can.
How about back button focus? Are you a back button focus guy, Russell?
I never have been. I've tried to use it from time to time, and I'll still try to adopt it from time to time. But for my personal style, I'm real comfortable with just using the front button focus and just sticking with that.
Yeah, and you know that is an interesting question. I mean, it's something you hear in the photography world. You know, as soon as you're a quote unquote advanced photographer, yeah, you got to be a back button focus guy. And I'm not either. I've dabbled in it. I've certainly I've got my camera set where I can use it. The back button focus, the idea is, people just think it helps you focus quicker on your subject. But I don't know. I find that I personally, I guess I'm so accustomed to the, just the standard hold your shutter button down halfway method anyway, that tends to work better for me. In a pinch, it's just, yeah, I tend to gravitate towards that myself as well.
Yeah, and two, I mentioned this earlier when I talked about my metering mode, and I guess I'm a creature of habit. I'd rather be ready for a picture than to think about how my camera works. And I know when I've switched to back button focus before, I would push the front button, and my first thought was, what happened to my camera? Then I'd be like, oh yeah, I set the back button focus. I got to push that button now. So, I learned I learned back in the day when it was all manual focus. Your back button focus was your left hand that you're twisting the lens with. And as autofocus improved and I started using autofocus, then there wasn't a such thing as back button focus early on. And so I'm just a creature of habit, and that's what I've always done. So nothing wrong with it. I mean, people do it all the time and they have great success with it. But for me, I just use the front button.
This is a good one. How experienced of a photographer do you have to be to go on one of your trips?
I would say, and you follow up on this, please, Russ. I would say you just need to be an experienced learner. I mean, I think if you've got some basic skills on, just being able to manipulate your camera, I think the trip would be ready for you, because we've got people of all skill sets, and that's what makes these trips both a challenge and an opportunity. And I'll say that on the first night, we'll have people on these trips that are everywhere from novice, they might have just bought their first camera a few months before, all the way to advanced that may have as much experience as any of the guides have. And so, really it's our job to try to find the sweet spot of how much instruction each person is going to require, and really try to get it, especially the beginner ones, trying to get them up to speed. So when they're done by the end of the week, they've got a lot of memorable pictures. They're not frustrated by their camera by the end of the week. They're adept enough at it where when they go out, they can capture the shots that everyone else is seeing as well.
Yeah, I really enjoy having new learners on the trip, and it's kind of one of the neat things. I mean, if you think photography is something that you're interested in getting into, I really think joining one of our trips is a great way to really like catapult yourself into photography world, because you're just immersed in it from the moment we show up at the orientation meeting to the moment we're hugging and saying goodbye at the end of a successful trip. I mean, it's um, and kind of the cool thing too is you've got a wide variety of skill sets on these trips. We definitely have the never evers, and then we've got people who are pros out there who really just want us to show them the best spots, during the best time, where the animals are, that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, and it's a great learning environment, just because we're in it together. We're traveling together as a team for the duration of the trip, and the groups are small. I mean, it's not like you're out there with 15 people. Average group size is about 6 to 8, and so it's really just a fun learning environment for beginners. I mean, we have partners who come along too, like usually like husband wives. So we will have like maybe the wife's a photographer and the husband's not, but maybe he brings his phone along, and they'll get into it too, even if it's not their main hobby. So.
I'm not much of a hippie, but the hippie that's coming out in me is one of the best things about these trips is how you get to that point of synthesis. I don't know, about day 2 or day 3 of these trips, where everyone's enjoying each other's company and everyone's learning from each other. I mean, even the experienced ones are learning something from everyone else. They may be learning about a new camera model someone has. They may be learning about a technique, or they may be learning about a location in another part of the country or world they've never been to. And for me as a guide, that's a pretty cool place to be, when everyone's gelling so well. They start, it's not a one-way street. It's not just me or Russ or one of the other guys telling them this is how you need to do it, or this is how you need to set your camera up. It just really becomes just everyone's learning at the same time, and you're helping each other learn, and that's pretty cool. And I'll say a little bit about my background. I was a high school teacher for 16 years, and I can tell you, when you can get students to the point that they can gel together as a team and start learning from each other, where the smartest kids are helping the kids who need a little more help, and the kids who need a little more help are teaching the smartest kids something, and everyone's kind of in it together. That's a pretty cool place to be.
Russell, where would you recommend selling equipment? Does KDH buy from people?
They do, but I'll tell you, I'll use an analogy. If you ever watch shows like American Pickers or Pawn Stars, you'll notice those guys always try to buy stuff really cheap because they want enough meat on the bone when they resell it to make some money. KEH is no different. That's how they're going to be. I would not recommend selling to KEH. If you've got the time and the effort, I would look into stuff like eBay. The cool thing about eBay is if you put equipment on there and limit it to just selling it in the United States, there's some scams that come from foreign countries that I think we've all heard about. I always sell just in the United States. And eBay has some cool tools that you can look at the selling history to kind of get an idea of where it's at in the market and be able to sell it. Or even now, Facebook Marketplace is a great place to sell it as well. But you kind of limit where your geographic region is with Facebook Marketplace. But if you live closer to an urban area, that might not be a bad idea. But yeah, KEH does buy, but just know if you've got a camera that you paid, say, $2,000 for, they might pay you $500 for it.
Yeah, I'll echo that completely. eBay has historically been one of the kind of the most well-known places for photographers to sell used gear online, and it's especially lenses. That's typically the way to go. That's what I've done as well. Minimal camera equipment that would be recommended for a backcountry trip. This is from Angela. I guess the answer to that, Angela, is usually you probably want, if your goal is to really kind of get yourself into a photography learning environment, you should probably have a camera that can be set into a manual mode, meaning a camera where you can adjust the shutter speed and the aperture and the ISO independently of some kind of auto feature. So you know what, even some of the nicer phones these days have manual camera settings. So I mean, that's an option. We've certainly had people just bring phones if they didn't want to dive head over heels into exactly what camera to buy for a trip. Phones are fine. But the other thing is you can rent gear, and that's a really good way to do it. And if you were to join a trip, we can certainly steer you in the right direction of like what to rent for your first trip. And that might be a good option because one thing you're going to learn a lot on a trip is you're going to see other people's gear out while they're out there, and you're going to see a lot of group members with different stuff, whether they're Canon or Nikon or Olympus or Panasonic or Sony shooters. A lot of new Sony shooters these days. With their great mirrorless lineup. I mean, you're gonna really get a sense of what people are liking, what works, and you might like learn a good combo while you're out there that you wouldn't have thought about before. But what I would say is that most people on the trips have either a manual DSLR or a mirrorless camera. That's usually what people are bringing on these trips. And I think that's all the questions we have. So thanks a lot, folks. Thanks, Russell, for joining us.
Yeah.
This is.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was gonna, let me interject real quick. Friday, if you're interested, it'll be kind of the more advanced part of this presentation. There'll be a few more advanced topics about wildlife photography I'll talk about. And let me just reiterate to you guys, if you have